Hi everyone, it's Father Michael Chummer here with another episode of the Normal Christian Life podcast. Something that I've not done a lot, but we're trying to remember to do is just to really try to be intentional about promoting this podcast. So we've not really done a lot. If you're a faithful follower of this podcast, it's not something we're constantly doing, and it's not something I really like to do in terms of like the whole marketing thing, but that's just the reality that we live in. And so if you're supporting this podcast, and that'd be really helpful is to review it on whatever podcast platform you use it on. And then apart from that, to, rate the videos on YouTube if you use a video podcast, to leave comments, these kinds of activity, show the different respective platforms that this is an active podcast. Certainly sharing it with your friends is a helpful thing. For those watching, I'm here in my brother's studio, so hopefully it's not too confusing. So today we're going to talk about friendship. So friendship is something super important in the normal Christian life. And it's something that we all feel really passionate about. And depending on how this conversation goes, we could really even dig deeper and just talk even specifically about community. But yeah, I think it's tempting. At least for me, I'll say this from my experience when it comes to the Christian life. It's a little bit unique because I really just had a lot of resources and I got into this stuff on my own. And I did live it on my own in some sense, not completely, but prayed on my own, went to confession on my own. I just learned a lot of things on my own. But I think it was fine for the time, but I think to really deepen, we really need good friends. And I'm sure we'll pull up some good quotes from saints in scripture that talk about the importance of friendship. I mean, Jesus didn't just say, hey, come take my classes. He was a teacher, but, he says, I've called you friends. You walk with them and really transform them to the power of friendship.
So something that I was just talking the other day with my friend, Father Tony, who we've had on the podcast a couple of times, we were talking, and we've had occasions to reflect on this in the past. We were giving like our vocation testimony, telling our vocation story. And something that has been really striking to me ever since entering seminary was just how different friendships are that are based on the Lord, that are based on shared faith. C.S. Lewis talks really beautifully about friendship and about different kinds of love. And he talks about the difference between romantic love and friendship love. And he says in romantic love, both persons are like looking at the other, like there's an element of being like enamored with or in love with the other person. But in a friendship, two people are kind of standing side by side and they're looking together at something outside of themselves, like they're pursuing something together or they're pursuing someone together. And that's something that you have to experience for yourself. And if you haven't had a friendship that's based on like both of you seeking the Lord wholeheartedly, maybe you haven't really totally felt that. But it was really striking to me when I went to seminary. So just for those of you who have already heard my story, you probably remember that like I was kind of far away from God, far away from my faith. And that was true of my friend group too. Not that everybody was like a terrible person, but it just wasn't a group of friends who sought the Lord. And nobody was really actively living as a disciple. Nobody was really practicing any particular faith. Maybe I think most people were raised at least somewhat Christian, but at that point, like in college age, we weren't. None of us were really seeking the Lord. So when I started to do it on my own, like you said, Michael, it was kind of isolating. But even more than that, it was really hard to make progress. Like it was really hard to grow closer to God and to grow in holiness, to make this more than just a hobby, because I would learn about things, I would read about things, I would listen to these podcasts, and I'd be really convicted by it. But then I would go back to the exact same context of my people I hung out with. And, like, again, it's not to judge them or say that they were such terrible people, but just nothing about our friendships was rooted in these truths that I was learning. None of it was based on Jesus. So it was kind of like being pulled in between two different worlds, like a tension between what the truth that I'm convicted by, this person, this Jesus I'm hearing about and people are preaching about, and then going back to these friendships where we don't have that. It's not at all part of our relationship. So I think we mentioned it recently, that famous expression, again, not sure if it's like a social science fact, but experientially it rings true that you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And I mean, we've all experienced that there is at least a great truth to that. And if you are spending almost all your time with people who, for whatever reason, don't really want anything to do with God, or they're not really disciples of Jesus, it's really hard to just like, even in terms of like my own walk with the Lord, if I'm not like, unless I'm having great success in converting them or like bringing them to Jesus, like it kind of begs the question of like, or it raises the question of what am I doing as a disciple if I still want to spend all my time with people? And something that I'll just share, when I was going through this process of getting really deep, like way deeper in my faith, something that was super convicting to me was a homily of Father Mike Schmitz, where just this one question, it just kind of haunted me, or it just really cut me to the heart. What he said, question, he said, people will object, well, I'm going to help my friends, or like, they need my like witness, or they need to see my faith. That is a really beautiful instinct. It's a great instinct. It's something that like, hopefully we can do to some extent. But he asked this really tough question as like almost like an examination of conscience question. He said, question, you've been friends with this person for 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. How much have you helped them, and how much have they held you back? So when I looked at myself, like, I'd been trying to follow the Lord for a year or two at that point, and I had to honestly just say, like, it's holding me back. And does again. It's not to say, like, make a judgment about where they are in life, or that, but just being honest with yourself, like, maybe there will become a day when I'm going to be more of an influence, but especially when you're outnumbered, like, 5-1 or 3-1 or whatever it is, just to give yourself permission to say, like, I need this, and it's not selfish. Some people, I think they'll think it's selfish, like, oh, I'm just going to like save myself. And we all need to have some basic coherence between our personal convictions, our faith, our relationship with Jesus, and our environment. We can't, there are missionaries. There are times when we have to bring the light to the darkness to be the city set on the hill, but like that can't be day in, day out. My whole life is just totally surrounded by an environment that saps my faith. That's my just initial thoughts. And as we talk about this, like, what does Christian friendship look like, I guess?
Yeah, Father, I love that you talked about your friendships in college. I had a number of amazing friends back in college during my conversion. There was like a group of 12 of us, and we kind of sought the Lord together. And it's so interesting now because I think as young adults, one of the biggest angst of the Catholic culture, maybe, or if you're Christian, maybe it's in your Christian community, is that it's really hard sometimes to find friendships of that caliber, of that level, especially of that type of vulnerability. I think for especially the young adult community, when you're young and you have school and youth groups, you kind of have friends that are around your kind of activities, whether that means sports or youth group or some kind of hobby that you're involved in. And then you go to college and you kind of have friends around your college friends. And then what I find often with the people that I minister to, especially in that young adult kind of stage prior to marriage, and then even in marriage, those relationships change. And who are the people that you're going to walk with? And for me, it's finding people that are of the same kind of love for the Lord, but also people that I enjoy. And I love this because you look at Jesus and his 12, like he had people that he walked with intentionally with his 12, but he had some that were his close friends. Some who were disciples. We look at, like all the disciples who walked with him, obviously Andrew, John being one of the main, and Peter. But even his friends like Martha and Lazarus were really great friends. Throughout scripture, Jesus went to his house and spent time with them. So he had fellowship and meals. And I think it's important when we have these friendships. There's some that maybe if you're in ministry, there's some friends that I do ministry with. And I know you're on this podcast. So the people that I do ministry events or we kind of collaborate. And there's other friends that are just lovers of Jesus that might not be in ministry, but just actually have it a forefront in their life. And then I have other friends that I might know in other areas of my life, like who I went and hung out with in high school or a different season of my life that I'm still in relationship, but those relationships might be different based on our journey with Christ. And so wherever you are, if you're listening today, what we want to just propose is really talking about what Christian, and I'd love to get your input, what Christian friendship should really look like, and maybe some of the hiccups or challenges in the culture we live in today on how to find relationships that really bring meaning.
Yeah, friendship really is based on like what we pursue together. So Chris, you were talking about this analogy of friendship as two people standing side by side, which is kind of funny because we're doing a podcast together, we're side by side, but like what is it that you're pursuing? And so I think like the depth of like what you're pursuing will be the depth of the friendship. So, I mean, even like high school, I was in track and cross country and band, and I like being in those things. It was really fun. I just like the people, just like humanly speaking, like I really got along with them. But once those things weren't there, uh, the friendships kind of went away. Even apart from the fact that they went away, it's not just about like, well, maybe this this hobby can be sustained so you can sustain the friendships. There's also the depth of the friendship. So, if you just watch football with a certain friend, like the friendship's just not gonna be that deep, and I had friends that I just more play video games with and, more service level things. Yeah, it's not to say it was evil or horrible. It just wasn't really deep. And so I think when you're pursuing the deeper things, it doesn't have to be faith, but of course that's the highest pursuit, but even just like something meaningful about like making the community better. Of course, as a priest and living with like eternal perspective, I do think like that common pursuit of like pursuing God and being like saints, like trying to be saints together is a really, really encouraging thing. And I'm sure we can have lots of examples of all of us, how certain friendships have fizzled out and then how certain friendships have remained. And so even like work, there was guys I worked with at Culver's. I was a manager and, really connect with a lot of people I worked with. And I appreciate those friendships. And I don't know, like I still stay in touch some, but not as much as I used to, of course. And the opposite example of someone who like I wasn't around a ton, but the friendship was just very deep was my friend Catherine Porter. And so I met her on a retreat. I was a seminarian. She was a senior in high school. And I just like connected well there. I didn't really see her for like basically like 4 or 5 years. I saw her at a C conference and we talked for like 30, 40 minutes. And then like 3 years later, maybe 2 years later, my friend moved out to where she was living and they made this connection like, hey, we all know each other. And so then I went to Denver to go visit Catherine and my friend James. And so I just spent time with James, of course, but then also Catherine, who I really hadn't spent hardly any time with at all. And just had a really, really deep connection. So really since that point, we've just been very, very close friends. I'm very good friends with her husband too, Joe. But it was just a very remarkable example to me, like how such little time together, such like little shared life, there was still like this really deep connection. But it was really based, a lot of it was really based around the Lord and like a desire for holiness and formation and growth and like renewal in the church. And so, yeah, I'm sure you guys have examples too, but yeah, I think when you pursue the higher things, the depth of friendship is definitely way higher. And it just completely dominates. Time spent is important, but it completely dominates the quantity of time spent together. And it's not to say that things are always just like some super deep theological conversation, because there's like just ordinary fun stuff, but definitely having those elements of faith is huge.
Something you said about like when it comes to keeping in touch with people, it's something that I've noticed like going through college, going through the first college seminary, first few years of seminary, is that it's a unique challenge in our time now with technology. Obviously, like goes without saying that technology makes so many things possible. It makes this podcast right now possible, and it allows us to stay connected with the people with whom we really want to and need to stay connected. But I think it also places this kind of unspoken obligation to keep in touch with people. And it kind of just, it's not that even necessary that's so time consuming, because you could easily just say like, well, how long does it take to send a text message on someone's birthday? Or how long does it take? Yeah, it doesn't. But in terms of your attention and like what your heart is set on and like who your heart belongs to, it is kind of fragmenting. It kind of divides you up into, dozens or hundreds of people. So obviously we all know that, we can't actually be like active friends with the 1,500 or the 3,000 people we can be friends with on social media. And so it's kind of created this new category of friendship where it's like, maybe somebody that I was actually doing life with, like sharing life with for a time. And the fact that like we had a really meaningful time together, maybe for a few months or a semester or a year, it does create that sense of like, oh man, I should be doing that. And so I know for me, like something that I've had to deal with is just admitting to myself that I can't sustain certain relationships, and just to acknowledge that like a relationship can be really good, valuable, and a blessing from God. It can be exactly what I needed for a time, but that doesn't mean that I have to maintain it at that level, or that like it was meant to be forever. Like once I'm a friend, I have to always be their friend. And it's like with your experience with Catherine, like you did have a great connection, like you connected initially, but then years passed by, and it's people do say that often, even from a secular standpoint about true friends, is that I can kind of pick up where I left off. Like my older brother, I just went and visited him last week, and it honestly felt like I hadn't seen him in person for a few years, and it just felt like, oh, hey, man, what's up? Like, good to see you. Like, it was just like we picked up where we left off, and I'm not saying we have like this super deep, close relationship. We actually don't, but just those people that and you have known, and you have connected with, family or friends, you can pick back up. And so, for me, I think there's a need to like give ourselves a little bit of permission and grace with navigating like which relationships do I invest in. I should have looked up the number. There's some, I don't remember the name of the number, but there's some like, it's like a sociological thing where it's like the something number, and it's like 154 people. It's like the golden, like the people have studied all these people's relationships, whether it's like family, friends, like, associates, and then like work contexts and things like that. You can only sustain like, it's like 100, average person can only sustain like 150 people. So it doesn't mean that the other people don't matter or that you can't reconnect, but I just see when it comes to attention, to like mental energy, is psychologically, our just having some sense of like simplicity in our life. It is necessary. We have to be way more intentional about that than somebody else would have had to. Normally in life, people move away. You finish, you graduate college. Just the way life goes would have done that for you. It'd do the work for you. Like, okay, they moved to California. It's like, well, bye. Like, like might write you a Christmas letter, but you're not going to keep up handwritten correspondence with hundreds or thousands of people. So it's just to acknowledge that unique challenge, and then like to help us remember that we do have to kind of combat that, so we're not just needlessly investing in something that really has kind of passed. Like, and it's okay if it was for a time. That's not a judgment on the relationship, but just give ourselves that permission.
I know that for many of us, a lot of our friendships do kind of come passing and going on social media. And so it's so important that we're intentional with our friends. But here's my question. I am a female on this call, one of the only one. And there's two males. And one thing that I think is really challenging, and I would love to get your input on the differences between male and female friendships. I find it's been interesting because I've done a lot of Steubenville talks or talks in different genres and places between whether it's a youth or an adult. And I think there are different types of friendships, even in different ways that we connect and communicate as male and female. And in my experience, like, it's so funny because when we get girls together, we could talk about, for women, like some of the underground things or the challenging things. I think for men, there are probably less challenges and some of the ways that like female friendship and dynamics can play out. But this is what I do think is I'd be curious to know, what does intimacy look like for you in male friendship? At some of the conferences, it's been really interesting having women's sessions where we talk. Oftentimes we'll do a women's session or we'll do a young adult session about friendship or relationships. And it's so different because the girls are all like hugging each other, like sharing, and like being all girly and doing all those epic things. And I mean, I don't care what age you are, right? Like there's just a moment in us that we like I will just say this. My friend and I, it was her birthday this last weekend. And you know what we did? We rented a hotel, and a couple of us just hung out in a hotel room just to get away from her kids and just to hang out. And literally, she told her friend told her son, who's like in his 20s, and he's like, "Mom, that's weird," right? But she was like, "I just want to be with my girlfriends, and I don't want to deal with my kids." And we just took some time out, and we laughed, and we talked about ministry, we talked about life. We had ice cream. This is probably too much, but I'm curious because I think for women, it's kind of within our culture. We have more of a tendency because I think by our nature, we're more relational, right? Women were made, I can go into Adam and Eve, but Adam, the first thing that he saw was things. And for women, for Eve, the first thing that she saw was Adam. There's something about our hearts that I think can kind of naturally come into that disposition. And I know friendship is very powerful with men, but I'm curious for you, for whether or not they're male viewers or female viewers, I'm curious as a female what your experience is with other male friendships, like in your life. Is that something, do you think that it's harder? Do you think it's easier? What's the dynamic? Like, tell the ladies listening on this call, what's the dynamic for male with male friendships? And is that different as you get older?
Yeah, this is something that interests me a lot, the difference between men and women. I do have a lot of guy friends, like priest friends, just lay friends, religious, not religious, but also have a lot of friends that are girls. And so it's something I think about, these differences. Personally, I don't know. I might need to be more patient because, I don't know, like as I get older, I'm a priest. Like I really value like deeper conversation and vulnerability, intimacy, authenticity. And so sometimes I'm just like really like women, how they're just like, they do seem to be more relational, but I don't know. I think my personally, like the close guy friends I have, I do think there is like a healthy amount of vulnerability and things like that. So, uh, yeah, I know why guys aren't as comfortable with it. So I think, I don't know. I would say like guys don't tend to talk about feelings as much, naturally speaking. Men can have deep conversation, but I think it usually comes up in the context of something else. Like, I know it's like, might sound like a kind of classic example, but like hiking or even like going on a walk or on a drive where it's like not looking at the other person. I would just say, maybe even just like as a practical tip or advice, I would say that guys really should learn from women more. Like, I think it's not like we should need to be women. I'm not saying that at all, but I think women have this capacity. And so it's like, if they're gifted in this capacity, like, why don't we listen to you more and learn from you more? I think, especially just in faith in general, like women are just so great for modeling faith and things like relationality. And so I think it's actually the job of women to teach men these things.
I like what you said about how with men, it tends to come up more naturally in the context of other things. So something that it's happened in my experience is that men tend to be task oriented and like problem oriented. So like wanting to fix a problem. Now, if you know anything about like when somebody's struggling, if you just immediately try to jump in and like fix them or like treat what they're going through as just a problem for you to solve, it can be a real turnoff, and the person can feel like you're not really listening to them or not seeing them, and you're just trying to like basically put an end to the inconvenient thing that's coming up in the conversation. But I think for some reason with men, maybe it's kind of back to that point I was saying with C.S. Lewis, where you're both looking at something outside of yourselves. I think for women, this might just be something kind of mysterious in the feminine nature that's just different. Whereas like women are more comfortable like turning toward one another and like talking about how they feel about each other. And for men, like they will care about how the other person is feeling or how they're doing, but it just feels there's an intensity and a kind of like an intense relationality and vulnerability that happens between men. Yeah, I don't know. We go getting into kind of even like the biology of it. I mean, like in this, what might be kind of controversial to some people today, but like women don't really, women do not compete for men, naturally speaking, the way that men compete for women. Like historically, in different cultures, men are kind of like even a healthy sense of competition, like trying to urge one another on to like be stronger, kind of a healthy sense of competition. And oftentimes they're trying to like prove themselves to women. And so there is like, I think that goes deep in us, in our nature. And I'm not even saying that's also mixed in with sin and, and all that. But I think men are like the fact that we want to prove to each other that we're strong, and like to prove to the women that we're strong. Vulnerability is just less desirable for that. Like if you show weakness or you show that you're wounded or something. And then maybe also, I think just even, this is my own opinion, my own experience in recent years, is in response to that lack of vulnerability and that lack of emotional intelligence of men in recent years, there has been a big problem with effeminacy and men like kind of swinging the pendulum all the way in the other direction, where it's like, men posting on social media, crying, and just like kind of these like, and you mentioned it, Mary, too, like that kind of false vulnerability or that fake vulnerability. I kind of call it kind of like a emotional exhibitionism. And so I think in an effort to like, no, men have feelings too. It's manly to cry and like to show your emotion and things. I think that's a lot of the people pushing that are doing it in a very misguided way. And it makes the men who were already afraid of like vulnerability or who equated vulnerability with just weakness, it makes them kind of double down. It makes them like, no, like, and there's just kind of lean on that kind of more that stoic approach, that stoicism. So I think healthy men, well-formed men, like really emotionally mature men, showing vulnerability in a way that's masculine, that is not just like looking for an opportunity to talk about how I was a victim or how hurt I am or everybody was against me or something. I think when people when people show that emotion in a very weak and kind of victim identity kind of way, it's a real turnoff. So like it falls to us men who have been maybe better formed, who've received the good influence of women and other healthy men and being formed in it, that depends on us to like help awaken other men to healthy sharing. I've seen that in my own experience, like in men's groups, whether it's like college age guys or the men's group of my previous parish. There was really a beautiful vulnerability, and you could tell it wasn't easy for guys to open up. But most of the time, people were not talking about their feelings. They were talking about, something they did recently or a project, and we were talking about the faith and, theology, and men wanted to talk about like kind of intellectual stuff. But then when it created a space where people felt safe and where it was healthy, and people like, someone would talk about something that was really difficult and they'd be crying. And it was really beautiful. It wasn't just like, that wasn't the whole purpose of the group is like, I'm not saying you have to like trick men into being vulnerable, but we have to see it as a valuable experience. We have to see like that it's part of the context of like men strengthening one another. Iron sharpens iron. It's not just like, let's just stop trying to be tough. Let's stop trying to be, masculine. Let's just like learn to be like women and share our feelings. Like even I think a very healthy, emotionally mature man being vulnerable, it can and I think it will and it should look quite a bit different. Than it won't just be like, it's not like the goal is to meet somewhere in the middle. Like, well, women are just really emotional and they're always sharing stuff, and men are just all about getting stuff done and fixing problems and not talking about their feelings. And like, it's not that both sexes are supposed to be like androgynous, like in the middle or something. It's really like, no, there is a masculine way in general. It's not like there's one cookie cutter version of that either. But those are some initial just thoughts in my experience.
Yeah, I love, Father, that you talked about that experience as a Christian with those men, like what it looks like for a group of Christians to come together. There's going to be, whether it's male or female, and you're listening today, I would love to talk about, we talked about friendship, male and female, but I do think there's a different context to what it looks like to be Christian friends. You talked about iron sharpening iron. And for me, I think sometimes my friendships with people that really seek the Lord, I will say that, my question is, how does it look different? Like, what does a Christian friendship look like, or someone that is living their Christian faith or their Catholic faith look like versus maybe a secular friendship? Or should those look different? Some people have friendships with all different kinds of people with different faith backgrounds, and maybe that friendship doesn't look different. But I want to just propose this idea of holy friendship, of this idea of friendships that actually have a goal of pursuing heaven together, of pursuing the Lord. And some of the qualities that actually are kind of rooted in that dynamic. I love that you talked about that story of the men at the retreat, because I think in Christian community is where we learn the culture of heaven, where we learn what it looks like when Jesus says, I no longer call you servant, but I call you friend. And I lay my life down for my friend. There's a way in which Christian community, the ecclesia, like the church, the early church, had fellowship, had this deep way of walking together. And I think we're going to do another podcast specifically on community. But within that community are relationships that actually hold each other together and walk with each other. We see that within the Old Testament with David and Jonathan, right? We see it with Aaron and Moses. We see it with Ruth and Naomi, these kind of moments of hardship where Christian fellowship kind of comes in and stands in the gap. I even love St. Paul as he has Barnabas. Like, Barnabas was like his wingman, his buddy, and all of his missionary pursuits. And so, and all these different examples, I think there is a way that I want to hone in our conversation about, for those listening, you might be like, well, I have a lot of friends and they're Christian too, but what might, like when it says iron sharpens iron, I would love for you to share, what does that mean? Like in your life, what are some examples of maybe what a Christian would maybe do differently than maybe a secular friendship or a work relationship that might have a different flavor? And if you could share some examples of that in my life or maybe your life, I think it would give some context to kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I might try to answer this just by sharing like my experience of friendship, and so maybe I can kind of pull out the deeper principles. But I mean, I have many great friendships, but one's coming to mind right now is my friend Father Michael Byrne, who I've mentioned I think before, but I think it's a great example of like Christian brotherhood or even Christian friendship. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's definitely some particularities that we're priests and we're men, but maybe there's something that we can glean from that. So one, I think in general is that, well, I think friendship is important in general because the Lord like designed us to not be self-sufficient. I mean, I think that's pretty apparent. Like if you just try to go survive the wild on your own, like yeah, maybe some remarkably like awesome people can do it, like Bear Grylls, but most people aren't like him. And so, I mean, even just go out in the wild, and even if you're using like a knife or something, it's like, well, who made this knife? Who made this metal? Who mined the metal? All this stuff. So like God made us to rely on other people. And so I guess this is more of a foundational point. But yeah, I would say like when it looks like concretely for iron to sharpen iron, or for a brother or sister to sharpen each other. I mean, I think a lot of times is like we're not always just full of encouragement, full of like faith and hope and love at every moment. I think we can wax and wane in terms of our fervor, and I think that's definitely a way that we can help each other. It's just the fact that sometimes we're facing desolation, or sometimes we're struggling, and when you talk with someone who's not in the struggles, they can really just lift you up. I mean, I remember I think I might have even mentioned this before, but I remember being mad, and I didn't mention this before, but I was talking to Father Michael, and he's super funny. He's got a great sense of humor, and he wasn't mad. And so, I mean, he just instantly pulled me out of it. And yeah, there's just times where he's been maybe frustrated about something, or just like a little bit discouraged about something, and I'm not. And so, like, my encouragement, and also even the thing too is that sometimes our greatest advantage is just not, how should I say this? That we're not the other person. Let me explain that. Even like in spiritual direction, sometimes I'm a spiritual director and I really enjoy it. And there's times I have like some spiritual directors who I think are actually like pretty deep, and I'm like scared. I'm like, man, you're like really advanced with spiritual life, and I feel like I'm kind of like, I don't want to like compared to it. It kind of seems like we're like just in the same level, but I remind myself it's like I can just see things so much more clearly because I'm not you. Because it's hard to like, it's so hard to see yourselves clearly sometimes, and so sometimes it's just so clear to see someone from the outside. And like that's the thing too. Like in desolation, the enemy doesn't want us to talk about it because it's very clear to other people. I mean, there's often spiritual direction where I'm like discouraged or worried about something, and like my director just like is not worried about it, or he just like speaks the truth so instantly, quickly, and he just like sees like, oh yeah, you're just, you're listening to the enemy. It's just so clear for him. So, saying this maybe just very clearly, I think just in general we can encourage each other. I think we can impart our faith to each other, our joy to each other, because we aren't always just super joyful, super faithful, have a tons of fervor, and then also too just speaking truth and seeing the truth of a person, because when we're in desolation and discouragement, it's like very much cloudy, and so someone who doesn't have that clouded judgment, it's super helpful to just have another person. So that's what comes to mind to me in terms of ways that we can really help each other.
What strikes me when I think of your story with Father Michael Byrne, and also because I've experienced that with him in particular, and with you, and with other brother priests especially, is also this is unique to Christian friendship, is that the standard is outside of both of us. So as a Christian, as a disciple of Jesus, especially as a priest or like a professed, like a religious, like we all have very made it publicly clear, like I am striving to become like Christ. And so in saying that and explicitly saying I want to be like Jesus, I want to be a Christian, we're actually inviting other people to hold us accountable, not just to what they're comfortable with, or, not just so that we're not bothering people or having like little flaws or things that annoy people for that like human formation, but also like helping us be formed in that image of Christ. So like that's again back to that C.S. Lewis thing about like friends are people who are both working towards a common thing. So in a more secular friendship, we might like make clear like, oh, I have certain goals, or like I want to do this, or I want, I'll have a friend hold you accountable. That's really like the natural analog to the same thing. I mean, that's good if friends hold each other accountable. There is a kind of iron sharpening iron type of thing. Maybe in a secular sense, it's like aluminum sharpens aluminum or something like lesser. But no, it's still the same principle at work. I just think this is huge. So I wanted to share this little passage from Saint Basil. So Saint Basil is a church father, and he was very, very, very close friends with Saint Gregory of Nazianzus. So they're two of the three Cappadocian fathers, very instrumental in like our theology of the Trinity. They lived in like the late 200s, early 300s. So on one of their, I think they have a shared feast day. Yeah, a shared feast day, and the feast day is Saint Basil writing about his friendship with Saint Gregory. So it's kind of beautiful because that was like something the church wanted to highlight by picking that out as like the reading for their feast day, was how they had this intimate friendship that spurred them both on to holiness. So just one part of this quote, this is from that Office of Readings. Saint Basil says, "A single object drew us, our love for what is true and good. The hope of advancing in knowledge held us together, and as though some heavenly power were shaping our course, we steered our lives toward the same goal. But above all, we strove to take the lead in virtue, encouraging each other to holiness. We found in each other a standard and rule for discerning what was right. Our ambition was not to win glory for ourselves, but for the other, and we each saw our neighbor's fame as our own. We were as if one soul dwelling in two separate bodies. If this is not friendship, then what is?" I love how he says, like, we found in each other a standard. So to me, that just reminds me of when St. Paul says, "Be imitators of me as I imitate Christ." So it's like, it's not because the goal is for Basil to just become like the end goal is not for Basil to become like Gregory or vice versa. It's that they're each trying to be like Christ. And I see something of Christ in other people that just me abstractly, or even looking at, like, I got scripture trying to imitate Christ. We're just going to get it wrong in all kinds of different ways. It's so hard to hold yourself by yourself. It's impossible to hold yourself accountable to the great standard that is Jesus himself. And we're all called to become the image of Jesus in the world. And different people with their different gifts, different people highlight, they emphasize in the way they live their faith, they emphasize different aspects of Jesus, of that image that no one person can do. And so, yeah, something that the other person has that I lack, they help me to grow in that area. They bring that out of me, what I don't have. And then vice versa, maybe gifts that I have that they don't have, and it helped us all rise together. But just that, to me, I think is at bottom, the fundamental difference between a secular friendship and a Christian friendship is that it is good. Friendship is a good in itself. It's a delight. It's a joy that God gives us in this life to make life more enjoyable and meaningful, but it also has an end outside of itself, which is not, it's not just to enjoy yourself or enjoy company or to make the most of this life, but to like get to heaven and to be great saints.
When we have our relationships focused on Christ, it changes the whole trajectory of the friendship, that everything is Jesus, in him, through him, for him. And I know some of my friendships are Christian, and maybe we don't talk about Jesus as much, but I would say the majority of my close friends, my faith and my journey with Christ is the most important. And so, like, one of my favorite friendship is a friend that I don't think either one of you guys know, but she's an older friend that I've known for a number of years. And every time I talk to her, we are like, "Tell me what Jesus is doing. Like, tell me about your prayer life. Like, what's he talking to you about? Like, what has God been like? What have you been wrestling with in your heart?" And I know I have a tendency to kind of go deep, but it's those friendships that I can really talk about the Lord and connect with. Even yesterday, I talked to the youth minister, a friend of mine, and she'll be okay if I share this, a youth minister who I haven't talked to in a couple months. And She was actually the youth minister that led me to the Lord. And we haven't talked for a while. I think it was a couple of months, but even before that, it was a couple, like almost a year. And right away we go back to like, how are you? How's your faith? What's the Lord doing in your life? I know that's not true for all of us, and all of us have a different level of like comfortability. But I think as you grow, and I love when you shared those examples of the saints, when your focus in your life is really about Jesus, there's nothing better than actually connecting to him together. I remember my dad even coming home when I would travel. When I first started doing ministry, my dad like he was had a strong faith as well. And the first thing he would do when I would sit down would say, "Tell me about Jesus." And it was kind of our joke, but he's like, "Tell me what Jesus is doing. Like, what are you seeing? How is he?" We just had these kind of conversations. And I know for some of us listening, you might be like, "That's not my dad. That's not my friends." But I think that the call is actually to seek him, right? Like, this isn't just like, oh, find Christian friends. It's find Jesus. And as you find Jesus, your heart will burn for him. And then when your heart burns for him, you're going to look for others to burn together with. It's like Meshach and Abednego, like the three in the fire, like that place where your heart is burning for something greater than yourselves. And it doesn't matter your differences. It doesn't matter what your education is. All of a sudden, and this is what Christ does. This is like the power of the gospel, that he takes people that are so different and distinct, different backgrounds, different educational classes, like different nations, and all in one spirit in Christ. And something like organic happens because Christ in me is the center of our life and the center of our relationship. And it changes everything. It makes friendship even that much more fun.
It's very interesting how, like, many people in today's world don't actually have very many good friends. Like, I've heard, like, psychologists and counselors, like, they say it's a common thing when people say, like, I don't have one close friend. In terms of, like, the authentic meaning of friendship. Like, that's a common experience that people have. I've heard it said, at least like a joke, but they said that the greatest miracle of Jesus was that he had, 12 adult male friends in his 30s.
11, I guess.
Well, yeah.
11.
You get the point, though. And so it was interesting that, like, as I've pursued God more, it's like, it's a good problem to have, but, like, God has given me more friends that I can remotely keep up with. So I don't think we had to be friends with everybody, as you were saying, Chris, but it's kind of funny in a world where people can't find friends. It's like, man, I have, like, a decent number of friends I stay in touch with every once in a while, but, like, any one of them is like someone I could talk to, like, every day, basically. And it's like, the problem is just like, there's too many amazing people. Like, this is my grief. It's like, there's just too many amazing people, and I just don't like the time as they caught up with all of them. So, not saying that we should, like, live in that sort of frustration or anxiety, but, like, it's just like the exact opposite. And so that's what happens when we're, like, pursuing God or pursuing a relationship with him. I mean, just as a beautiful quote is Jesus says, seek first the kingdom of God, and these other things will be given to you besides. And so, yeah, you seek after Jesus, and you just find so many amazing friendships along the way. Mary, I mean, you're one of those friends too, and it's just, like, been, like, such an amazing joy. So I think something to say too is that friendships really are a gift from God. Certainly, like, practically speaking, like, we need other people to walk with, to, like, live in, like, to live in abundance, to thrive, to like maintain this state of consolation. I know we've said this before, but desolation is something that we're supposed to resist. So, one little quick aside, I sometimes joke with my friends, the Porters, Catherine and Joe Porter. Catherine, who I mentioned earlier, I said, we can't control God or anything like that. And I know we can't control our spiritual experience, but, like, kind of like hanging out with you guys seems to be like bottled up consolation. It's like almost every time I go to hang out with them, it's like I'm consoled. So, yeah, we don't want to be too controlling necessarily, but, like, we should pay attention to that. But anyway, so yeah, there's this practical aspect of we encourage each other, we console each other. Another huge aspect is, like, we affirm each other. That's a really important thing. Not just, like, affirming yourself, but really having other people affirm you is huge. But I want just to say too that, friendship really is, it's a gift. It's a gift from God. I think it's one of the most precious gifts that God gives us is really other people. I'm going to read this quote from C.S. Lewis. He talks about this. We've been referencing a lot the four loves, directly or indirectly, and he just talks about how God is arranging our friendships, basically. So he says, in friendship, we think we have chosen our peers. In reality, a few years difference in the date of our births, a few more miles between certain houses, the choice of one university inside of another, the accident of a topic being raised or not raised at the first meeting, any of these chances might have kept us apart. But for a Christian, there are, strictly speaking, no chances. The secret master of ceremonies has been at work. Christ has said to the disciples, you have not chosen me, but I have chosen you. Can truly say to every group of Christian friends, you have not chosen one another, but I have chosen you for one another. The friendship is not a reward for our discriminating in good taste and finding one another. It is an instrument by which God reveals to each of us the beauty of others. Whew! Love it. It's such an amazing quote. So, other people really are a gift from the Lord too. So that's a thing to mention when it comes to friendship. It's really an expression of God's love. And yeah, God does give us gifts, but the primary gifts he gives us is people. Well, of course, Jesus, his son, but then he gives us the gift of gives us the gift of each other. And I love the quote from Jesus, or what Jesus says in John 17. He says, he's talking to the Father, and he says, they are your gift to me, like talking about us as human beings. I know, like Henry Nouwen talks a lot about how we can to live our baptismal identity and know our belovedness. It's living with other people who help us feel feel the fact that we're a gift, that we feel our belovedness. And Conrad Bars, Catholic psychologist, talked a lot about affirmation. He talks a lot about how the gift of like knowing your belovedness and your goodness, it's really the gift that comes from another person. Like he says, you can't do it for yourself. So those are kind of some other thoughts that come to mind when it comes to friendship. Yes, there's the practical stuff, but then also there's just really seeing it as a gift from God and just not treating it as like an accidental thing. I think is important too, just to spark our wonder.
There's things that we can only receive from people that love us. I actually think sometimes, when it comes to like your mom or something, some people think like, well, you have to be nice to me because you're my mom or something. And there is a truth that, okay, yeah, it is good to get feedback and to get, whether it's, positive or constructive criticism or something, it's good to get from other people and not just people who are like maybe in a really biased way, just trying to make sure that you're not sad and trying to only trying to encourage you. But we have to keep charity and truth united. But I actually was thinking back to kind of the idea of like holding each other accountable is that we can only really receive correction from people that we know love us. So with the iron sharpening iron, whenever I know and I've got evidence like that you love me, that you want me to be holy, that you want me to be a saint, that you want me to hold you accountable too, that's when you feel safe, and that's when you're safe to be vulnerable. And there's things that I can receive from like literally, I think maybe 3 or 4 people in my life, maybe like I can think of people like spiritual directors, maybe my brother here, or like a couple of other people I've known in my life that I could receive certain corrections from. It's not even that if someone else said it, I wouldn't at all think that it was true. It's just like there's just this guarded state that you're in, and then you just kind of and even it could be like maybe I will think it's true if somebody who's not loving toward me or is not my friend said it. I might think it's true, but it might just be kind of crushing. Like it might not build me up. It might not actually be, because even a correction, if it's done out of love, is meant to lift that person up and to help to encourage them. So this passage from the Psalms always catches my eye whenever it comes up, like in the breviary or something. It came to mind. So it's Psalm 141, verse 5. It says, "Let a good man strike or rebuke me in kindness, but let the oil of the wicked never anoint my head, for my prayer is continually against their wicked deeds." It's actually something that comes up a lot in the Psalms and the wisdom literature, is that like what appears like, a little bit harsh or it might seem like something negative or a correction or a criticism, when it comes from a wise person or a righteous person or a loving person, someone that we know, it's a good thing. It's like a blessing from God. But so often people who don't really want what's good for you, who don't really love you, will flatter you. It's a really it's not just like, well, that's not totally true, or you're not giving me the constructive feedback I need. It can actually like send you down the wrong road because it can kind of like puff up your ego and things like that. So that's just, yeah. I know there's other scriptural things about Jesus teaching us how to correct one another and how to go about that. Like, he says, like, if your brother, if you have something against your brother, go to him and try to correct him, and then like bring other ones and try to correct him. So it's like this holy process of you have to have like a certain access to the person.
Yeah, and I think what I would just add to that is I think when we talk about correction, that's like a hard word because we think about school, or we think about maybe a teacher that's like correcting you, or. But I do think there's a place where we love each other by speaking the truth, and you have to do this with like a certain amount of discernment. And when I often say like for me, sometimes the Lord's not really inviting me to address something, and so you have to have a relationship with the Lord so that you know if it's your right to step in or not. But oftentimes I think for me in my life. Sometimes I don't feel comfortable, or I don't want to say certain things, or it might just be that person's personality. But I do think there is a place that we sometimes are the only ones speaking into other people's lives. And so we actually love people by speaking the truth. And of course, there's like ways of doing that which can honor them more than, just telling them like all the horrible things about them. But I do think that that's something in the Christian community that I don't know if we do often. We might get that kind of like feedback from our spiritual director or someone else, or maybe our husband or wife. But I think sometimes in friendship, unless we're doing it in a sarcastic way, kind of like joking or jabbing, sometimes people don't feel very comfortable actually having those hard conversations. And I will say for me, I've had a couple of experiences. Like one time when I was responding to something. This was a number of years ago, and my friend in love was just like, "That's just your pride," just as simple as that. Like, and I was like, and to be able to receive that with love, right? Um, and so I think that's the key, is just learning how to actually give that feedback, giving that thought, and then also receiving it as well.
Yeah, I'm just keep purposely following Michael Burnt here, but he's just on my mind. So I think that's another just great example, practically speaking, of there's a good healthy amount of like correction, and because we're just such committed friends, and because we're really focused on like, no, we want to be good holy priests, like we're just so much more open to it, and so we can just be like very honest. And oh yeah, there's just been times where we both like call each other out like pretty, and it wasn't like as much like a personal riff, but just like calling something out and like, oh, just mention something, and he like legitimately like thanks me and I thank him. And so I think sometimes when it comes to like correction, it's like, well, for a lot of like better case scenarios, it's like, well, it's kind of messy and really painful, but it wasn't that horrible. But like just to have it like and just be completely fine experience is like great. And so I know our psychology teacher at the seminary, she said should only correct to the degree that you support someone. And so, yeah, I think when people know that you really love them, that helps. But then also the fact, I think adding in the standard of Christ and pursuing this goal of sanctity, I think it just makes it better. I know this whole topic is on fraternal correction, but I think it's relevant because we're talking about how friendship, how iron sharpens iron, and how like friendships really help us. We don't have perfect self-awareness. Like that's in humility. We need other people. We need to be encouraged, call on. I mean, just think of any area where you're doing something challenging. Like what significant challenge in any area of life like is not dramatically improved by having like someone help you or being part of a team, And so, yeah, and, like if we want to take sanctity serious, we really need to have these like Holy Spirit filled friendships. We need Christ centered friendships.
Yeah. So if you're listening, my question would be, Father, maybe you could follow this up. Either one is like, how do you find good Christian community? I mean, especially now if you're Catholic and you're listening, there's certain things that are offered for certain age groups in the church. And I think it's hard when you're like kind of in your adult years and you're doing a job and you're working and you kind of have your friends and you're maybe trying to shift or either grow deeper into that friendship. I'm wondering like, where do you find your friends, right? Like, where do you go? Where do you go to find those people that if there are people today listening that maybe don't know
That's a great question, Mary. It's kind of like the key question, I guess, after this conversation is just, yeah, where do we find it? Where do we find friendships? Just to acknowledge that it's extremely difficult for people, even for people who are trying to be plugged in, that are trying to be involved in like a men's group, or especially like you mentioned earlier, Mary, I know for that age group of like, 23 to 30, like even for people who are looking, along a similar problem is like people looking for a spouse, someone who's totally, especially I know lots of younger women who are like, mid 20s, late 20s, early 30s, and they're just like very open. They're like doing what they can to put themselves out there. And it's just, there is just that breakdown of community in our society. So, something else I just wanted to say to encourage people who maybe they don't feel like they have a really close friend, or maybe you don't feel like you have at least a close friendship that's based in the Lord, is that there's kind of an infinite gap between 0 and 1. So if you can, I would say, keep persevering, keep praying about it. Like we had that quote from C.S. Lewis about how God has to arrange things. I mean, that's true of everything in our life, that God is always helping to arrange things for our benefit. So pray for a friend. And I think just to really relish and to invest in that friend, if when you do find a friend based in the Lord. Also, yeah, I mean, maybe shake things up a little bit. I know that there are people who have, a lot of people probably, who have friends that are believers, that maybe are like fellow Catholics, fellow Christians, and we maybe just that friendship, because of the history of it or whatever, it just that doesn't really come up in your conversations. Like so much of what we experience in consolation in our friendships is people talking about the things of the Lord. Maybe it's just a matter of shifting some of your conversation and like bringing something up, especially if like the person, professes to be Christian, or your friend, if you're both Catholic. I know I had friendships like that, maybe like in high school or just other times in my life where like we kind of both knew that we were both Catholic, or maybe people I knew like when I was in the military or something. And it just like, you just think like, oh, that'll be kind of awkward or be kind of weird if I brought that up. But it doesn't have to be some deep theological question. Just like, yeah, bring up something that you experienced, something that moved you, something that helped you, and maybe you can kind of can make a friendship that wasn't really based on God become much more so.
Yeah, I would just say things like retreats and conferences are really, really important. I know for like a lot of the amazing friends that I have met have been through retreats and conferences. Other church-related events too. I mean, certainly seminaries and that's like a friendship gold mine. Absolutely, but I know not everyone's go to seminary. Go to seminary. Yeah, well, be open to it. But no, honestly, though, like the conference and the retreats, I mean, that's like a very kind of a specific thing, but it's like, well, if you're trying to find someone's like, or we're going to have a Christ-centered friendship, like, where can I find someone who's pursuing the Lord? Like, well, people are going to conferences, like, they're taking vacation time, spending money, traveling to deepen their faith. Like, you can bet that they're probably take their relationship with God really seriously. What's actually great is that you can get kind of more involved in this like web of people. And so like we, like Chris and I and Mary have a lot of mutual friends. And so there's this web of people that you get connected into. And so, just in terms of how I met people, it really has been seminary and conferences, retreats, and I guess it's more of a practical thing. I know we recommend all the time, but like I know Encounter School of Ministries, the Encounter Conferences has been like a really great thing. There's other great Catholic things as well, like other conferences and retreats too. So I want to acknowledge that. Do you have any practical recommendations, Mary, for finding a good friend?
First, I would ask the Lord if He's asking you to come into a season of like the wilderness. There have been some seasons where the Lord has called me away from friendship, and just to focus on Him. So if you're someone that maybe has a bunch of friends and you're like, where do I find friends? It might be a season that you're actually called to just be with the Lord. If you're here and you're like, no, I really hunger. I feel like I just don't. Start praying for community. Start praying for friends. Start asking the Lord to show you. And whether that means someone kind of comes to your mind comes to your mind in prayer, or even someone that you might notice. I do life coaching, and I was working with one of my clients recently, and she was kind of on a similar page. She just converted, it kind of grew in her faith, and was like looking for Christian community. And so one of the things that I just encouraged her to do, like her homework assignment was I said, who do you feel drawn to, like in the circles? And she had gone to kind of some little event at her church. And I said, my encouragement was, can you ask someone for coffee? And she was, well, I don't really want to. And this is where we have to kind of step out. Some of us listening here are very extroverted, and others of us are kind of like, could be introverted and quiet. But you never know the people that are around you that are just looking to be asked to hang out for a short conversation or to do an event together. And sometimes we're waiting for other people to take the initiation, and God's waiting on you. So I just encourage you to be courageous and look and pray, and the Lord is faithful. He'll bring those people to you. That being said, I think we should just pray right now for those of us listening that God would just bless our friendships. And so if you're driving, don't close your eyes. If you're not, maybe you can. Heavenly Father, I praise you and I thank you for the gift of friendship in my life, and even the places of hurt that have come from friendship, the places of my own imperfection in friendship. I ask that you would bring healing for those listening. The places of our longings, God, I ask that you'd meet us there. Lord, you tell us in your word that you are our friend. And so, Father, I ask in your name that everyone listening on this call, that you bless our friendships. Help us to know how to walk as people really focused on you. Help us to be good friends. And God, for those of us who are struggling to find that community of friendship, Lord, I ask that you would open doors and bring people and life and relationships that can honor you. And we just ask this in Jesus' mighty name.